Good evening on this March 15th, 2023. I am your host, Laura Foley, with She Reads. And today we have a returning author, a phenomenal author, in fact, Reverend Dr. Nadine Rosechild Sullivan. She is a diversity and spiritual expert. Her education and life experience give her a breadth of knowledge and wisdom about gender, sexuality, ethnicity, race, and their intersection with spirituality. Dr. Sullivan works with groups and individuals to reduce conflict and resolve misunderstandings. As a public speaker and sociological consultant, Dr. Sullivan is available for seminars, workshops, lectures, focus groups, or consultation. As an ordained interfaith minister, spiritual and sociological counselor, and certified hypnotherapist, Dr. Sullivan is available for individual, confidential, and spiritual counseling sessions by phone, online, or in person. Can we please welcome her this evening? So nice to have you join us again, Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. If I can, I would like to read some from my book. This is my book, I Trusted You.
Yes.
Yeah. Fully and honestly speaking of gendered assault, which was actually, the title came from a quote. There's a journalist by the name of Geneva Overholzer, who sometime in the 90s, yes, 1992, made the statement in an article as an anti-sexual assault activist. She wrote, "As long as rape is deemed unspeakable and is therefore not fully and honestly spoken of, the public outrage will remain muted as well." And so the subtitle of the book comes from Geneva Overholzer's quote. And so I wanted to start, I've broken this book up with sociological facts and then stories, narratives, mine and others, and also poetry. So I'd like to start with a poem from page 13 called I Trusted You. I trusted you, trusted life, walked free with the breeze combing my hair, head erect, shoulders square, facing future. I was a warrior inside, vast, enormous, capable. The source of spring, ruler of the galaxy, wild, strong, and full of dreams. Through me, morning glories turned their faces to the sun. Through me, flowers bore their fruit. Through me, ice crystals formed on the skin of virgin snow, and God heard me on high. I was strong, compact, vigorous, alive, my body my own, free of vulnerable parts, muscles powerful. Victor in every contest, I bested each brother time and again, won, brought them down, received their cries of uncle, magnanimous. Let them go, showed compassion. I studied tadpoles, collected snakes, scaled trees, ate dirt, even worms, chased you with the large and hairy bug, studied dinosaurs, knew the names of clouds brisking my blue and open terrain, noted trade winds, sleuthed mysteries, created secret codes, played spy, round the woods, waded streams, unearthed fossils. I was large and the world revolved around me. I was pretty, dresses of taffeta and lace graced my form, ribboned pumps and tiny purses of real patent leather. I wore lace, reveled in the feel of my hair curling round my face. Life lay before me, open, a realm of possibilities, oozing promise. And then you came, and in a moment put out the sun, muted the song of birds, took the warmth from the air. I trusted you. I didn't know you. I trusted everyone, trusted life. And so I went with you off alone. No reason to suspect, no forewarning, no knowledge of evil, and innocent. And with your hand, and with your mouth, and with your misplaced lust, you took that which should have been, and all that had always been, and never gave it back. If I might, I'd like to read a piece called My Best Friend's Uncle, which starts on page 7. And this piece, this is one of my stories. This piece is the moment, the real moment when I begin to recognize gender betrayal as we experience it in the United States in the second half of the 20th century and the first part of the of this 21st century. So my best friend's uncle, a memoir. I was 12 years old. My mind was 12 years old. My body would have passed for 18, but I was not 18. I was 12. I had gone with my best friend, Regina, to her extended family celebration of the Easter holiday. We were all Catholic. I was Austro-Hungarian and Irish. She was German and Italian. But what happened that day happens in all religions and ethnicities. It happened then. It happens now. I was a baby boomer. I was growing up in a post-World War II U.S. suburb north of Philadelphia, and I had a very protected childhood. It was unhappy in its own way. I was often quite lonely, but prepubescent, I was indubitably protected. I had lived my 12 years in a very asexual space. No one mentioned sex. No one ever touched me inappropriately or even insinuated that such a thing was possible. In my family, the 12-year-old me had more than a decade's evidence that my father respected my mother. My grandfather respected my grandmother, and my great-grandfather respected my great-grandmother. I grew up in a family where never was heard a discouraging or sexually explicit word. I had needled and begged until I had gotten permission to go with my best friend to her family's Easter celebration. The food was fabulous. I was having a great time. We were just at an age when music and dancing was beginning to seem important. The high school we would be attending in a year or two had a weekly dance, and we were seriously working to learn to perform the fast dances and the steps of the line dances we watched on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. Another friend's older sister had taught me how to find the rhythm in a song the year before. We spent hours listening to our local pop radio stations, WIBG and WFIL. Regularly cutting the carpet in Regina's family living room was, to us, serious business. Regina suggested we go downstairs to the finished basement in the home where the family party was being held and turn on the radio and dance. I was amenable, as were a stream of younger children who happily followed us down the stairs. A few minutes later, we were also followed by one of Regina's many uncles. At one end of the room, there was a set of drums. Uncle Tony took a seat and began to keep time to the music. Thinking nothing of it, Regina and I continued to dance. A few songs later, a slower song came on the radio. Suddenly, there was an arm on my elbow. Uncle Tony had left the drums. He pivoted me around and began to slow dance. I don't remember whether or not I fell into step, but within seconds, he planted his right hand on my left breast and his mouth on mine. I froze. They say there are 3 response mechanisms to danger or assault: flight or fright, or fight or freeze, playing dead. They say it is the primitive brain that responds immediately at a level beneath conscious choice. He intended the element of surprise. And in the unexpectedness of the moment, in my utter confusion about what was going on, my brain stem inadvertently, without my forethought or cognition, responded by freezing, and I became rigid, like a statue. With time on pause, I remember puzzling, what is he doing? I became aware of the slime of his tongue, that it was extended beyond his lips, and in response, clenched my mouth tightly closed. I had never even heard of French kissing, and I remember wondering, why is he licking my lips? I was literally so actually innocent that I had no conceptual idea of either his actions or the fact that someone so much older than me, who knew I was a child, could be directing those actions toward me. In the very definition of the term, I was blindsided. You cannot see what you cannot believe. And I could not have foreseen this that I could never have imagined. Intellectually, I'm sure the entire event lasted only seconds. In memory, however, it is as frozen still as I was then, and it stretches out as a span between innocence and devastation. I'm sure it only took moments for Regina's little brother, Frankie, to begin to sing song. Uncle Tony's kissing Diane, Uncle Tony's kissing Diane, in the lilting tones of the 7-year-old. Regina's Uncle Tony let go. He turned on his heel and sped up the steps. Regina demanded, "Did he touch you?" I shook my head no. Maybe I said it, too. We went upstairs. As was common for preteen girlfriends, we went into the bathroom together. I started to sob. Regina exclaimed, "He did touch you," threw open the door and went in search of her father. Regina's father went in search of the offender, who had already hurriedly gathered up his pregnant wife and 2-year-old and fled. Regina's father was apoplectic. It was his brother. We left the party. Regina's mother was wonderful. She told me it was not my fault. She told me how wrong he was and how they would make sure he was not allowed at family gatherings in the future. They drove me home. Once home, I ran to the bathroom and began to scrub my mouth with the Comet cleanser I found under the sink, hoping the chlorine bleach in it would take away the dirty feeling, kill the germs. I kept scrubbing my lips, but the feeling didn't lessen. I crawled into bed under the covers, way under the covers. When I woke the next morning, for just a second, I felt fine. But then the memory, and with it the confusion, and an overpowering sweep of dirtiness flooded back in, and I was overwhelmed with nausea and the desperate desire to simply go back to sleep, where I could escape both feeling and memory. I pulled the covers back over my head. Through my window from the backyard, I heard the sound of a basketball dribbling on the asphalt court my father had installed, and knew that it meant my brother's friend Jesse was there playing ball. Jesse had given me my first kiss just 2 days before on that very basketball court. I should have been ecstatic with the anticipation of the sight of him. I pulled the covers over my head tighter. As the day wore on, my mother came looking for me. I pled illness and retreated even further. It was months before I began to feel normal again, and that only with the help of Regina's mother, who brought up the topic periodically, reaffirming my worth and reaffirming her in-law's error, opening a space for me to process the assault. Not much happened to me physically that day. An uninvited hand on the breast, an unwelcome and intrusive kiss. Physically, it was not the stuff that alters your perception of sexual acts. It was not the kind of assault that required stitches or time for the body to mend. But my world changed. Until that frozen moment, I thought I mattered. I thought men respected women. I was an American. I thought my mind mattered to the men around me. After all, they, males, my father, male religious leaders, were educating me. I thought my character mattered. I was being given a religious education, and I was being churched. I was surrounded by women of piety and faith, my mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, Regina's mother. My grade school teachers were women with a religious vocation who dedicated their lives to their faith, to their God, and to the education of children, even girl children. But Uncle Tony and many of the boys and men who followed, most of whom played by the rules and at least sought to date me before they sought to touch me, changed that perception. Regina's uncle was merely the start of a parade. From that day forward, I began to feel not respected like a person, but disrespected like a random body. I began to notice what sociologists call the male gaze, the sense and reality of being scanned by each male I passed for the acceptability or unacceptability, for the sexiness or lack thereof of my body, of being primarily a body. I began to recognize that in many of their eyes, I was merely a walking vehicle for a pair of breasts, breasts to which they often talked when addressing me instead of meeting my eyes, and an available vagina. Breasts which even a random man might walk up to and without invitation reach out and touch, like the guy whose hand I had to knock off as I descended a subway stair while he ascended the other side. Regina's Uncle Tony began my sense of betrayal. The world I had been sheltered in those first 12 years was a fairy tale of my mother's careful construction. She never warned me, but she kept me safe as long as she could. And not warning me was, for her, a part of keeping me safe, of not letting me know there was a world out there that would treat me poorly. But once I, as a girl, was out beyond her view, the fact that there were perpetrators in the world came home to roost. You think it would be okay if I read one more?
Yes, go ahead.
So I want to read Uncle Charlie from page 125.
Yes.
Charlie was blood to me. He was my paternal great-grandmother's brother. My dad had known him all his life. When my father was born, he was the age of a grandparent to him. And when I first met him, I was swathed in a little white gown, bonnet, and booty set, and trundled into his sister's, my great-grandparents' parish church, the Ascension of Our Lord in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia at Westmoreland and F Streets. My twin and I were recent releases from the hospital nursery where we'd each been kept incubating until we'd attained the requisite weight of 5 pounds, 4 weeks for me and 6 for him. Charlie and his wife of 40 years, Margaret, had agreed to stand up for us. As part of the ceremony, they swore before all assembled, their church and the host of heaven, that if my parents predeceased them, they would raise us for God in the rights of our Holy Mother, the Church. I didn't see him often, but my parents would sometimes take my siblings and me to visit them, and my grandmother took me for an entire week the summer I turned 12, and again the summer I turned 14. I remember sitting on their enclosed front porch, listening to the 3 of them talk as people in the neighborhood passed by on the street out front. I remember Breyer's peach ice cream and the sudden rush of spicy bubbles when they let the cap off a new bottle of Canada Dry ginger ale and poured me a glass as they settled down to their evening shots of Crown Royal on the rocks. And I remember the cards they sent. Every Christmas and birthday, without fail, $5 would arrive in the mail, which I would then dutifully turn over to my father against my will to be deposited in my savings account that had his name on it in trust for my 25th birthday. And when in the same summer, my older brother and I got driver's licenses, one of our first big adventures was to brave the forbidding stretches of the Pennsylvania Turnpike and the Schuylkill Expressway between our home in Willow Grove and their home in Clifton Heights. I didn't know them well, but I treasured the thought of them, my own godparents, separate from my sisters and brothers, my Aunt Margaret and Uncle Charlie, sweet old people who seemed just as ancient when I was newborn as they seemed unchanged when I was 17. God-fearing folk who went to church regularly and served as icons of the person I was expected to become. Sometime after I left home, I got word that Aunt Margaret was changing. She was becoming senile, and so my parents were taking her and Uncle Charlie in. They arranged the bedrooms and gave my younger sister's room to Uncle Charlie and Aunt Peg, the altered version of my icon, Aunt Margaret. And as he always had, Uncle Charlie went to Mass every day. And he convinced my parents to join the Blue Army, a Catholic dedication to praying the rosary daily for the salvation of the world. And other things happened. I heard how Aunt Peg came running down the stairs and out onto the front lawn naked. A psychic scar I'm sure my then adolescent brothers still bear to this day, because that man, her husband, wouldn't leave her alone. And I heard how she made tomato soup with the ketchup. And then she died. I wept at her funeral, overwhelmed with the hope she had gone someplace good, someplace better than here. Weeks passed, and one day while I was visiting Uncle Charlie, he asked me to come upstairs for a minute. He had something for me. When I got to the doorway of their second-floor room, he went over to their dresser and brought back Aunt Margaret's engagement ring. It had a raised rectangular platinum platform with 2 filigree platinum hearts on each side, each of the long sides, and 2 diamonds on top. We didn't want to bury her with it, he said, and I knew she'd want you to have it. Tears filled my eyes. I left deeply moved and blessed to have been thought of, to have had my love for her recognized in so significant a way. A few weeks later, I was visiting my parents again, and Uncle Charlie did the same thing. He asked me to come upstairs for a minute, indicating that he had something for me. I knew he was clearing out her things, and I went with the expectation that he had discovered another of my godmother's possessions that he thought she would want me to have. When we reached the doorway of the room, suddenly, Charlie spun on his heel and planted his right hand firmly on my left breast and his mouth tightly on mine. I knocked him off and turned and ran down the stairs out of the house into my car. In a flood of tears, I drove to my best friend Regina's house. I remember crying so hard I was having trouble seeing. I remember almost swerving into an occupied lane to the right of me and ducking back into the left, realizing I hadn't even seen the other car. Regina listened patiently as I unburdened my heart to her, encouraging me to tell my parents. I remember saying, I can't tell. They won't believe me. He was the pillar of the church, the devotee of Mary, a member of the Blue Army, a daily communicant. I remember, I can't tell, being followed with the thought, I have to tell. I have younger sisters in that house. For the next few weeks, over and over in my head, I repeated those conflicting mantras, torn between the urgency to tell and the surety that telling would protect no one, because I would not be believed. About 3 weeks after Charlie molested me, my parents went away on vacation, leaving the oldest sibling still living home to watch the youngest. The phone rang. On the other end, one of my younger sisters sobbed out my name, followed simply by the words, Uncle Charlie. I started for my car. A friend and roommate there when the call came, seeing my condition, stepped in, took my keys and drove me. We picked up my sister and took her back to the safety of our home. There we talked. We listened to her. We encouraged her. We fed her M&Ms. We reconfirmed her worth. We assured her she had done nothing wrong. She had been sitting on the couch. Charlie sat down next to her, which was not at all unusual. Suddenly, he leaned over and kissed her as he simultaneously tried to slip his hand beneath her shirt. She also had broken away and immediately called. When our parents got back, before we could get there, the siblings who had been babysitting described to them how I had swept in and spirited my sister away. As we entered the house, our parents sent her upstairs to interrogate me. How dared I have taken her away without their knowledge or permission? I began to explain what Charlie had done. In unison, both parents and one brother leapt to their feet as though stung, loudly exclaiming, "She's lying, you're lying." That attack was followed by Dad pounding his fist on the table, demanding, "What did you tell her about sex that she was able to make up this lie?" My younger sister was the model of veracity. She had never been spanked, not because our parents didn't believe in spanking, but because at the first hint of adult or older sibling displeasure, she would hop up and comply. Nothing about her deserved even the hint of a suggestion that she would lie. She may even, at least at that age, have been constitutionally incapable of lying. And nothing about her accusation revealed any actual knowledge of sex. From a purely physical perspective, what Charlie had done was minimal. He had not gotten far. She had gotten out of it. She had gotten away. Charlie was called in for questioning. Looking me defiantly in the eyes, he stood and denied touching her. Then finally, I told what he had done to me just weeks before. That he did not deny. Instead, he justified. In front of me, he responded, "But she lives on her own. She's a woman of the world." In that instant, he finished the betrayal he had begun by touching me, and for me, his humanity evaporated. He showed me that to him, his years as my godfather did not matter. His vow in the church before God with me, an infant in his arms, did not matter. Neither did it matter to him that I was blood. The 62-year difference in our ages, 83 to 21, did not matter. All that mattered was that I was female, and female in a way he felt made me questionable. I had left home. I must be a whore, a slut. I must be indiscriminately sleeping with men. Why else would I leave home? I must be promiscuous. I must be that kind of girl. Since I was, in his imagination, dishonorable, he had the right to take what I had not even conceived it possible to desire or to give. Unknown to us at that moment, one of our younger brothers, Sean, listened from the other side of the pocket door that separated living room from family room. He heard our sister called a liar. He heard Charlie deny what he had done to her and be believed. He heard Charlie justify what he had done to me, and heard that no one, no parent, no sibling, raised a word of objection on my behalf. He heard our parents stand with Charlie. For him, it confirmed that he had been right not to tell, not to speak out against his own abuser. In the aftermath, our parents did not make Charlie move. For the next year, he continued to live on in our parents' home, unsupervised, with no protective measures taken to ensure the safety of any child. Each night at the dinner table, refusing to be afraid, my younger sister bravely forced herself to continue to occupy her assigned seat, which had all along been next to his. And each night, during dinner, underneath the table, Uncle Charlie slipped her a $5 bill. Also, each night just after dinner, my sister would wait until our mother was busy washing dishes. Then she would march into the kitchen and poise, hand extended over the trash, until our mother turned around to see who was there. Then, in plain sight, she would drop the $5 bill into the trash. Our mother never once asked, "Where did you get that money?" or the obvious, "Why are you throwing money away?" About a year later, of his own choice, Charlie decided to move out and move in with some relatives of Aunt Margaret's. A short time later, of old age, he died. I did not attend the funeral. My younger sister had no choice. Neither did my brother Sean, who listened that night from behind the door. Until the day each of our parents died, whenever Charlie's name came up, often in the midst of a funny story about Aunt Peg's senility, one or both of them would look at my sister or me and say, "Well, you know, Charlie had diabetes, and the research shows diabetes can make you do all sorts of things." To which I invariably responded, "Diabetes can make you tired. Diabetes can make you cranky. Diabetes can make you confused. Diabetes can even make you comatose. But diabetes can never make you find a flat-chested, prepubescent girl an attractive or appropriate sexual object. Diabetes cannot make you a pedophile. Neither can it make you commit incest." Sean could not escape his perpetrator. His was not an old man. He was not able to knock him off or get away. For him, the abuse began about the age of 5. The night he listened outside the living room door, he was 10. Confirmed in his intuition not to tell, for many more years, the abuse continued on relentlessly, affecting every area of his life, even his grades. Teachers accused him of not paying attention or of daydreaming in class. In regard to schoolwork, they assumed he was lazy. In reality, he was unable to concentrate out of the daily necessity of planning, scheming, searching for ways to keep out of the path of the abuser he knew was waiting. Along the way, he learned to disassociate. Eventually, he developed traumatic amnesia, repressing the memories of the abuse and the abuser, common psychological adaptations that allow the personality of the child to survive until they get old enough for the abuse to stop and it becomes safe to begin to process what are finally memories. At 33, an incident in the life of one of his children brought the repressed memories flooding back. After that, Sean only managed about an hour's sleep, long night after long night. He would wake, night terrors filling him with the reactions that attend the victims of childhood sexual abuse, the symptoms of post-traumatic stress and generalized panic disorder. He remembered how, when he was young enough to still take his bath with 2 younger brothers, he had gotten in trouble with our mother for marking himself up with a permanent marker. The older boy had drawn a bullseye around his genitals. He remembered being raped orally, anally, behind the garage, in the basement, around the neighborhood. He remembered this neighbor boy, the best friend of a brother who was between us in age, tying a rope to his penis and leading him around as if it were a leash, yanking it painfully backwards or sideways if Sean in any way displeased him. As the memories tormented him, he sought help. He found an online group for male survivors and a therapist experienced at working with issues of sexual assault and began the work of recovery. At 36, he had surgery to correct the damage the rope leash had done to his penis. Sean is still working through the years of sexual terror. Even now at 49, the night terrors wake him several times a week. Recently, in the midst of a nightmare, he attacked his partner in his sleep. As part of the process of his recovery, with the support of his therapist, he pondered the idea of approaching our parents and sharing his experiences. Finally, alone with Mom in her kitchen, he ventured to share his childhood experiences. The first word from our mother's mouths were, "Why didn't you stop him?" Later, at a diner, he told Dad. In response, Dad, dubiously, as though questioning whether or not the former 5-year-old Sean had been a willing participant, paused, then drew out the words, "He forced you?" as a question. So pause there. I chose those stories because Sean's story brings up the, what it is when one can't get away from their abuser in an ongoing way, whereas my stories don't bring that issue up in the same way. But but the inability of parents to respond well, or of also there's a difference shown. So the book has stories of male victims and female victims, and you know, a range of issues, domestic violence story between, you know, with a lesbian partner. But in one of the differences for males and females, so, you know, for children, we know that 1 in 4 children are sexually assaulted before puberty, and 1 in 4 girls, and 1 in 6 boys. But when we talk about the 1 in 6 boys statistic, we don't know if boys, so neither are likely to report, but girls are overwhelmingly disbelieved and accused of lying. Boys are expected somehow to have been able to fight it off, and therefore accused of wanting it if they didn't, which is, you know, absurd when you've got a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old, and that kind of age disparity.
I must say that the stories you told and the way that you told them were so well written. And I must say, some of the stories that you have in your book, I was like reading them, and when they ended, I was like, oh gosh, I didn't want it to end that way. Because a lot of times you hear about, you know, there being like a real finality to the story. You know, either someone has passed away, or now, you know, they're running for their life, or they're in a shelter, or something has happened. Not that, well, I was finally allowed to go home, and when I did, I found that my husband had taken up a new hobby, and it was gun collecting. And then they just kind of leave us there. And it made me wonder, like, oh my gosh, like, what's happening to them now? And was
but how do you get out of that if that's if you have the misfortune to be partnered with an abuser, in all probability he love bombed you from the gate, right? And then, you know, when you've let your heart go, when you've fallen in love or gotten engaged, some abusers wait till you're married, some wait till you're pregnant. You know, pregnancy can be one of the most dangerous times for women in domestic violence, and they'll actually attack the breasts and the abdomen, and cause a high rate of fetal mortality as well as, you know, maternal mortality. But with that, by the time something like that is going down, you're often so trapped. And we have, as a culture, we've all, you know, we've been like, what's wrong with her that she's with this perpetrator? What's wrong? Why doesn't she just leave? But if he's taken up gun collecting, you know, and you know, from like, you know, in the domestic violence movement, we learn to recognize that she knows best, that the victim knows best whether or not he's blowing smoke or he means it when he says he'll kill her, you know. And you know, if he means it, and he's, you know, like there can be literally no way out, or no way out until children are grown, or no way out until, you know, there are abusers who steal the money of their partner, and how do you get, you know, like, so there's just this and an unjust justice system that also assigns female women who stand up in self-defense and kill their abuser, like they'll do 25 years to life, whereas a man who kills a female partner, you know, might do 5 years.
Yes.
So there's just, so oftentimes we really are trapped, you know, at least for a window.
Yes. And I believe too that person was completely trapped, you know, and she probably felt that too, because the first time when she found out that her husband was like molesting, you know, one of their children, you know, she went ballistic, and the police were called, and he remained cool and calm, collected, and everything he said. And they just thought, oh, she's, you know, obviously off the hook, because she was still angry and upset. They took her out, and she couldn't get any assistance or any help, didn't know what was happening to her children while she was, you know, out of the house. And so with that kind of experience, and knowing that no one believed you and no one helped you, you know, you go back in and think, well, I've got to stay for the kids. And, you know, you just assume that if it happened again, you know, then maybe you would never see your kids again, or you wouldn't be believed. So therefore you figure, well, like it or lump it, I got to stay.
And the law thinks of the police, and the police think of themselves in those settings as being gender neutral, because there's some small percentage of the violence done by that women do. So when we look at violence in general, especially interpersonal violence, it's overwhelmingly in the 90th percentile perpetrated by males. And as a sociologist, I argue that that is because of socialization in our culture. This, every message little boys get is about being tough and being strong and taking what you want. And, and there's just this masculinity that's put on display that encourages this. And so some percentage of them then live that as a lifestyle. There's other people who are nice guys, right? But there are, and most of the men who are perpetrators are serial perpetrators as well. But overwhelmingly, violence against women and violence against other men is done by men. Violence against children overwhelmingly by men. But the only place where it drops below the 90th percentile is in sexual assault or violence against children will be 15% women instead of 2% or 4% or 6%. And so so there are a goodly number of men who have experienced being sexually assaulted by a female, a babysitter, a mother, whoever, an aunt or whatever in prepubescent. It does tend to end, sexual assault does tend to end for boys as they get to be 14 or 15 years old. And they get old enough and they, to fight back, to resist. Whereas for women, it tends to go well through our 30s. It's the same kinds of rate. And then it never really goes away. I mean, we all hear the horror stories where some 80-year-old woman is dragging her groceries home and, sexually assaulted by some much younger man who clearly didn't find her sexual. So there's a power harmed dynamic playing out in all of this. Misogyny, actual hatred.
How do you think we can better educate the police and criminal justice system to see the difference between the aggressor and the perpetrator?
There have been people trying. So our movement against sexual violence, especially sexual violence against women, goes back, or against women and children, goes back really to there's some of the forerunners where there was a Miss America in the 1950s, Marilyn Vanderburg, who came out about being the victim of her father's incest throughout her childhood and adolescence. There was, Christina Crawford, adopted daughter of Joan Crawford, actually, Mommy Dearest being her real tell-all. There's a woman named Katie Kessner, who in 91, made the cover of Time magazine as a young college-aged woman who had been sexually assaulted on a date, but with another college student. And she, came out and she resisted and she spoke up. And she actually founded the Take Back the Night movement. And I met her at a police station where she was trying to educate police officers about, how to recognize victims of acquaintance rape. And but it's really rough, because what actually happens in our system, we talk about women pressing charges or victims pressing charges, and what actually happens is, if we are in that situation and we end up in the ER and we end up going through the rape kit and all of that, the police are called in. And the police officers actually decide whether or not to take it to the district attorney. And district attorneys are elected officials and they're lawyers, and they need to win their cases, and they need to, or they're appointed, whichever it is, but they're lawyers, and they will decide whether or not they think they can win a case, and they are the ones who press charges. And then the victim is called as a witness for the state. And so what generally happens in the, that 82% or whatever the percentage is, around 80%. Forget if it's 78 or 82 right now, but the percentage that is acquaintance rape, overwhelmingly, the district attorney or the police officers decide that this can't be prosecuted, that it's a he said, she said, or whatever, that there was no witness, and that, the perpetrator is saying the victim wanted it, and there's nothing, they can prove sex happened through the rape kit, but they can't prove consent or lack thereof. And so those cases just overwhelmingly don't go to court. The ones that do go to court are the victims of stranger rape, and because the DA feels like they can win them, and then and the victim is called to testify whether they want to or not. They're subpoenaed, they're brought in, and if they're impregnated by the rape and the rapist figures that out, because they're showing by the time they get to court or whatever, the rapist actually, even a convicted stranger rapist in all states, has the right to win custody and visitation rights with a child created by his stranger rape. And there are a handful of states in which there have been bills proposed and or passed which would allow the victim to petition the family court to sever the parental rights of the convicted rapist, but you've got to have the money to take that case to court. You've got to have the money to hire a lawyer and do all that. So we have a very unjust system at its core. And part of it is because it's a system that's arisen from patriarchy. If we go back, just a handful of decades, I know women just a couple of years older than me who were fired because they got married, fired because they got pregnant, not allowed a credit card in their own name, had to be in their husband's name. Just the level at which women were subjugated under the rule of men, really until the 1970s and beyond and later. In fact, there's most states didn't declare that there could be rape inside a marriage. A man was just considered to have the right to access no matter what. That was in the late 70s and 80s that states were changing those laws. And so forgive me for forgetting, but I just recently heard about a state in which actually marital rape is still not considered a crime.
I haven't heard that one, but it doesn't surprise me though.
Yeah.
Which is sad to say that, things that are that vivid or graphic or bad don't surprise us.
There are a number of states right now also seeking to cement or lower the age limits at which an underage girl can be married. So in the move to forbid choice, one of the things that's happening is some of the states are putting forward laws. So every state's got an age of consent, but below that age of consent, they're pushing laws where a parent can sign for you to get married, or a judge can sign for an underage girl to get married. And this is sort of an answer to teen pregnancy, is to force her to marry whomever impregnated her, whether it was, well, and she's too young to marry anyway. She's underage, she's a child.
Yeah, and when you think about that, that's so detrimental to like women from like India, and even those that come to the United States whose parents say, yeah, but we've already planned out that you're going to marry this guy by the time you're 12. And then if the court is going to sign off on it, because the parents think it's okay, it must be, it's like the parents don't have their child's best interest at hand. It's kind of like their own monetary best interest is what they've got for themselves. How much, sometimes how much money are they going to get? Is this going to be a good marriage? Is it going to uphold the family name, whatever? So that's why, parents are very willing.
And in the United States, it can also be religion. So it can be, I don't have to feed her anymore, but it also can be, well, she's shamed me by getting pregnant outside of wedlock. And so if she gets married, then, that like makes it all better. So,
correct.
Yeah. The religious factor that's in there too.
On page 42, Christopher Kilmartin says, some still consider rape an act of male sexuality gone awry, rather than an act of violence. Why do you think that is?
We have these cultural rape myths. And one of the key rape myths is that men can't control their sex drive. So there's been eras in which they argued about whether or not women have sex drives. We clearly do. We have the same fetal tissue grows into, sex genitalia with sex-specific nerve endings. Both genders have hormones. But in that old thinking, only men had sex drives, or men had much stronger sex drives. Men have needs, boys will be boys. And so it's viewed as, in that space, it's viewed as, you know, this guy couldn't control himself. He got turned on, therefore, like animalistically, he was forced to continue and finish the act, as opposed to he could get up and go home and take care of himself later. You know, I mean, there's just this, you know, inability, this willingness to give men a pass on self-control. Sometimes that same pass is given to them for violence in general as well, with this, you know, it's manly, or, you know, the right way to be, to angrily stand up for yourself, or to go take what you want, and you know, step on everybody else's head to get to the top of the ladder, kind of thing. But and there is there is penetration and ejaculation involved in some measure with rape, right? But it still is, it's an act of deep hatred. It's an act of violence. It's an act of, you know, some maybe of self-hatred as well. There's you know, inside of this, taking somebody who doesn't want you. Like, what is that? You know, I can imagine a sex drive. I can't imagine one taking, you know, going after somebody who doesn't want me. If they don't want me, I'm going to go home. You know, I'm going to go find somebody who does, or I'm, you know, like there's just no need for somebody who doesn't want me. So the doing of that is an act of violence. There are two really interesting films. One is called The Hunting Ground, and it's about rape on college campuses. And another is called The Invisible War, and it's about rape in the military. And the film, The Invisible War, and there's, I believe, a book by the same name, so both talk about how most perpetration is by serial rapists, and that if either colleges or the military removed those people, that the numbers would plummet. But in the military, so there's a smaller percentage of females who are military personnel. And so the percentage of females who are raped is higher than the percentage of males. But in raw numbers, more men are actually raped by other men in the military than the raw numbers for women, because there are more men. But perpetrators are after violence. And so men in the military may be, you know, jumped by a number of guys from behind, may never even see who the perpetrators are, but, you know, be assaulted by more than one person, you know, in the dark as they're going to the latrine or whatever. But those numbers, those statistics are really high. And so that is an act of violence, right? That's not, and again, with Uncle Charlie, you know, diabetes can't make you find a flat-chested prepubescent girl an appropriate sexual object. But there's no pheromones, there's no sexual development, there's nothing. What is it that makes a pedophile, right? So and I could argue that today's pornography increases the number of people who find themselves in that space of, you know, being pedophiles. But there's always been this through human history. And what is it? If somebody's if you are sexually assaulting a child, you clearly know this child doesn't want you. You clearly know this child is afraid. You know, there is, Oprah talked about, you know, body betrayal. And I think, you know, and with Maya Angelou, they had some conversations about it back a few years ago on television. But, you know, Oprah has said that the person who perpetrated against her as a child didn't cause her physical pain and stimulated those sex-specific nerve endings. And so she experienced eventually her body responding, even though her mind and her emotions were horrified, right? Yes. So that disconnect between the body and the mind and the spirit. But oftentimes, you know, a child is being physically hurt as well as emotionally traumatized. And the perpetrator would have to sense that they are not with somebody who's responding with passion and with desire. And so what are they getting out of it? You know, it has to be if they have to be getting off on the harm they're causing, they have to be getting off on damaging that innocence and causing that kind of trauma. It's just, you know, there's no other real explanation that at least that I can think of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think the response would be if we change the narrative of boys will be boys and we turned it into girls will be girls and we pushed back?
And so if girls were being girls, what would we do to push back? We wouldn't likely become sexual assailants, right? You're not arguing that. You're saying fight.
No, but like if we were instilling in our daughters and instilling in girls, you know, to take a stand, say no, and not allow things like that happen. And we actually pushed back and said, no, I'm sorry. You're not allowed to put your hand there. No, I'm sorry. I don't want to, you know, date you. I don't, you know, no, you can't call me that, and to walk away. You know, how would that, like, how do you think that narrative would change?
So there's a part of that that's an excellent idea, because there's a part we haven't done, but there's also a part we have done. So we began women's self-defense classes like in the 70s.
Yeah.
And we do tell, especially incoming college students, but maybe even high school girls, but certainly college students, watch your drink, don't put it down, don't pick it, you know, if you put it down, don't drink from it again. I had one college undergraduate tell me she took a sippy cup with a lid to the bar, had the, you know, watched the bartender make her drink and then kept the lid on it the whole time. But we tell them to go in crowds, to make sure they stay with their friends and not separate. Of course, this doesn't always work. Sometimes your friend just gets drunk and wants to go with him and abandons you. But we give girls that message in large measure. And we're not giving boys the same message about don't assault and, you know, you need affirmative consent. But over on the other side, what we have not told girls, what we've also told girls is that it's not ladylike to be angry, that we teach girls to care about relationships. You know, we're teaching boys to go get ahead in their careers, and we're teaching girls to like build families and be caregivers and nurture children and nurture our relationships, right? So we end up with, as a, you know, counselor through the years, you know, we end up with women who are always trying to fix a relationship that an outsider is like, run, screaming, now get out of that relationship. And she's like, well, maybe if he didn't mean this, but he meant that, you know, and I could just change this about me, then maybe he would like me then, and, you know, all that. So
if I cooked better,
if I cook right,
if I cooked better, if I cleaned better, you know,
if I lose 10 pounds, you know, whatever that is, right? But so we do train our daughters toward caring about men. And we love our sons. We love our, if we're straight and we're pansexual or bisexual, we're partnering with men. You know, we love our partners, we love our sons, we love our grandsons, we love our brothers, we love our fathers, uncle, you know, like we love the men in our worlds and in our lives, and we're each in these family structures in one way or another. So there's a level at which, like, how do you change that? So we could raise girls to be less afraid of physical conflict. So I never got punched as a kid. And maybe one of my brothers did get punched by some boy on the schoolyard or something. So we could potentially do more instead of teaching karate to college girls. Maybe we should be putting all our daughters in self-defense classes, and, you know, instead of in ballet or with ballet. So there could be some of that, but there's also the fight, flight, freeze thing. So there's a level at which we're not making the choice, because perpetration is an act of surprise. It's an act of opportunity. It's a crime of opportunity. It's, this man is watching for when no one's watching, and to, you know, if necessary, they've groomed us. One one undergraduate story that I remember. She had a group of friends and they would all get together and, watch the ball games on television every week and, drink a beer or two. And then they'd all leave her. Then somehow it happened a lot at her dorm room and they'd all go back to their dorm rooms and her friends would disperse. And there was a guy who'd been part of this friendship group for months, like anybody else that she knew. Everybody was relatively new because she was relatively new to college, but she was a semester or so in with this group of friends and she trusted all of them. And the one night, the one guy didn't leave, he left last, right? So he was leaving last. And with everybody else gone, he turned and locked the door and then he raped her. How he then, and it happened in such a way that he could overpower her. I did not read My Story Shattered from the book, but when I realized that was going bad, I was already underneath of him. And there's like, what do you do when you're already underneath of someone? And I didn't realize. So actually, the first story in this book what was written by the person who wrote Good Boyfriend Material. I'll say about that in a minute. But as I was writing through this, I remembered things I'd forgotten, like dredging up the sand and like pulling things back up. And it was like, I had forgotten that he was actually wearing a body cast. But as I was writing, I was like, oh my God, he was, like I remembered. And there was actually nowhere to land a blow on him if I could have, right? And so what actually happened was I had never written any of this. I had gone back to school later in life because for gendered reasons that are a different story, I was deprived of college at the proper age. And so I went back after a number of years of marriage at 45 years old. And I ended up in this, student-led women's coalition and ended up vice president of it. And we were doing a Take Back the Night event. And other women were standing up and telling their stories or reading their poetry. And I was too terrified. I'm looking at these 20-year-olds and I'm 45 and I'm too terrified because I'm thinking that college I was thinking about the long walk to the car where there were a lot of really long parking lots at that school and you could never find a spot, but way down the end. And so I didn't write anything. I didn't read anything. And then somehow in the next year, Angelique Owenby, whose story Good Boyfriend Material is in the book, she asked a professor in our classroom, she had won a local beauty pageant, and she asked if she could read a piece to our class. She wanted to use it as her platform for high schools and middle schools as an anti-sexual violence piece. And so she wrote Good Boyfriend Material, and she read it, and I was so first off amazed by her, but I was also ashamed of myself as I listened to her story that I had not had the courage to tell mine, that I went home and I wrote for like 18 hours. And the only thing I learned in Catholic high school was to touch type with my eyes closed. And so I wrote it with my eyes closed and just walked through the memoir of the rape on a date that cost me my virginity. And so in writing through that, I then the next year got the courage to write the poem I Trusted You and the poems that are in this book, and read the poems at the Take Back the Night event. And then across the years, I would read Angelique's story to undergraduates, and then asked her permission to publish it in this book, and and wrote more stories and wrote stories from interviews and the found the sociological data and filled it in. But this book really started, because of that. But there's so many settings in which we're actually physically at a disadvantage before we realize what's happening, or we're so taken by surprise and off guard that we wouldn't have time to kick or punch or bite. And the other thing is we partner in really differential ways. So I was 5'11" as a younger person. I've shrunk a little and I don't like it, but I used to be 5'11". I didn't like that then either because I was head taller than all the girls in the class and I felt too tall. Now I want that back. But the man I married was 6'3". So he had 4 inches on me. And, he had upper arms that looked like he went to the gym when he didn't. And he was a sweet guy, and he never lifted a hand against me. In fact, if he got mad, the worst he ever did was just sort of say, he sort of made a growling noise and walked out and came back and talked about it later. But very, very sweet, kind human being. But in that space, if he had been domestically violent, if he had been violent, there wouldn't have been anything I could do against him. His hands, his feet would have been lethal weapons against me. Even, maybe if I could have like judo flipped him or something. And so, but really, he was so much bigger than me. And we do that, I remember in high school, and the boys asked you to dance, and they came up to your chest, and you didn't want to dance with a boy who was too short. Like, it was weird. And so you wanted a boy at eye level or higher. And so even though the height differentials of males and females, you can overlap them as these, distributions, the statistical bell curve. They overlap, and there's just like tails of the distribution where men are taller and women are shorter. Most of us are in this range of being relatively similar in size, but we date and partner in differential ways. And so we end up in relationships where what happens is, if he had been violent with me, I would have had to reach for a weapon. And so I would have, if I had reached for a knife and killed him, I'd have gone to jail for murder, because I'm breaking gender codes to do that. Women don't actually, in truth, have a right to self-defense in the United States, in our legal system. Juries don't view us as having. If we remember the case of Marissa Alexander a few years ago, she had gotten out of, she was 9 days postpartum with this newborn, and she had a toddler, and she had a domestically violent husband, and he began to rage. And so she's standing in the kitchen, and somehow she got the babies into the car, and then she couldn't find the car keys, and he'd followed her into the garage. And I don't know why there was a gun, where it was or whatever, but she found a gun, and she fired it at a wall of the garage. She did not fire it at him. The children were already strapped into the car to the seat, to the best of my ability to, suss this out via news reports then and since. And I believe he even testified on her behalf in the court trial, but she was sentenced to 25 years for, I believe it was 25 years, for endangering her children and using a deadly weapon. And there was enough of a public outroar that after she served 3 or 4 years, I'm not looking at my notes, but something like that, she was released, but still on probation for the rest of her sentence. She wasn't acquitted, none of those things. And so, and she hadn't shot him, she hadn't hurt him. She was firing a warning shot and she was in Florida, which has a stand your ground law for men, or for white men, where you can shoot somebody in the convenience store parking lot and say, I was standing my ground, I was afraid for my life. But not if you're female. And she was also a Black female, but I don't know of any cases where white females have been able to defend themselves in Florida either. So, or around the country, right? So, her horrific miscarriage of justice in regard to Marissa Alexander. And I don't know who raised her children for the window of time that she was in prison, but he had every right to be the parent of custody while she was in prison.
Yeah, and
his rights.
And that just amazes me that, there are still some states out there that, the men can do whatever they want to and the women can't. And when it comes to something like that, the women are severely punished and the men just get, a little pat on the back.
Yeah. A little slap on the wrist and, don't do that again, or whatever. Yeah. So you had asked before about training police. Actually, police have high rates of domestic violence. All male peer groups have higher rates. So when we segregate students by gender in high schools or colleges, all girls schools, what will happen is the women will do better academically. They'll concentrate more on their studies and learn more, excel more.
Yes.
But there'll be increased levels of violence in all boys settings. And then when we get, the military, at some level, it attracts some percentage of men who are given to violence. Certainly it attracts people, who are honorably willing to defend their country. But it also attracts some people who are going because there's guns and because, you know,
Yes,
they
definitely.
like that edge, right? So the number of perpetrators in the military is higher than even on college campuses. But so men in the military and also men in the police force they have really high rates of being domestically violent, and so to in the watching Katie Kessner try to educate a group of police officers in a suburban Philadelphia location a few years ago, it was a hard sell. And she's a good speaker, and she's been at it for 2-3 decades, whatever it is, and or whatever it was when I saw her. But um, there was a resistance in the air to the thought that somebody who went on a date had a right to say no. And there's some real evidence that just having a simple sip of a glass of wine with a man is viewed by police and district attorneys and court systems as consent. One of the things I try to teach college undergraduates is there are 3 classes of people who cannot say yes to us, you know, and one are clearly children. Children can't say yes. And I tell them, I'm not talking about the 16 and the 17-year-old who are dating and they're already a sexually active couple, and then the 17-year-old turns 18. I'm not talking about that situation, but, you know, I am talking about underage people and adults. And there's no, you know, the 13-year-old can't say yes to the 45-year-old, and neither can the 17-year-old say yes to the 25-year-old. So there's no consent that can be given by a child to an adult. There's also no consent that can be given by those who are mentally handicapped. So if someone's IQ is below, you know, IQ is somewhat of a, you know, controversial measurement, but there's some truth to IQ, but there's also a level at which actual quickness can't be measured apart from culture and knowledge. But in as much as we can, IQ's average about 100, and, you know, somebody who's 110, 120, 130 is high IQ, 130 being a whole, you know, plus a whole standard deviation, and down a whole standard deviation is 70. And so, you know, the lower one's IQ, the less one's able to consent. And if somebody is below 70, they're not considered to be functionally able to consent. They're mentally handicapped at a level that does not allow you know, them to say yes, especially to somebody with, you know, an average IQ. And also it's people who are inebriated, people who are drunk or high in some way, stoned in some way. You know, if somebody's on a date, it's one thing, you know, if I have a long-term partner and we have 2 glasses of wine, you know, we can say yes to each other. But if we're on a date with a relative stranger, you know, and we're drinking, it gets to, you know, it's like, okay, let's talk and get to know each other this time, and next time we'll ask, you know, do you want me? But you know, somebody who's actually drunk, you know, if they're lying naked in front of you, cover them with a blanket and leave them alone, you know, and because they can't say yes, right? And we need, it's not just she didn't say no, and that's how courts have done it. It's like she didn't say no, she was drunk, or she doesn't remember who perpetrated. So even though other people witnessed it, you know, he can't be convicted because she doesn't remember the perpetrator, or she was, you know, she was drugged in her drink, and so, you know, she didn't say no. So like he thought she, you know, it's like, so we're you know, hoping, we're working to change that, right? Working to get judges and cops and college boys and whoever to see that differently, to see that somebody who is drunk can't say yes to us, or really high.
Well, as we're wrapping things up here, because this was a phenomenal evening and everything went really quickly. I just have 2 questions for you. One was, in the very beginning of the book, you share that you are a survivor who has processed your experience and has come to the other side. What words of wisdom can you share with those who have yet to process their experience and who are still ruled by their assault?
The biggest, so there's 2 pieces. One is recognizing how many millions of people this happens to, so that we come to understand this isn't me. I didn't, well, one, I didn't rape him, right? I didn't do this. And not only like, why did he victimize me? No, the level of victimization and perpetration in this country is so enormous, or globally. 1 in 3 women globally, the UN statistic, are beaten, raped, or incested in their lives, right? So in that, it's not us. It's not the victim, even if the victim experienced body betrayal, or even if sometimes victims who are victimized repeatedly as children, as they do get hormones kicking in and they don't have anyone to have sex with now that their bodies are getting turned on, they may seek out the perpetrator for sex. Still, that's not where this started. That person's not at fault, right? So there's one is recognizing, so there's a politicization of it, making it political, realizing that this personal is political. This is millions and millions and millions of victims and millions of perpetrators. Why is that happening? So that's one part of it. That was really huge. The other part, though, is I think differently than most people in regard to this other part. People talk a lot about forgiveness. I said in the piece that Uncle Charlie's humanity evaporated to me.
Yeah.
He really no longer felt like a human being. You know, he was 83, but I'm sure if his mama were alive, he would still have been a human being to her, but not to me. And I think it's not about forgiveness. So in spirituality or in religions of various kinds, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever, they will talk about forgiveness and how it's important for ourselves. It's important for us to forgive the other person, because if I carry around anger and hatred, I'm hurting me, not them. But the problem with that in regard to sexual assault and domestic violence is this. Until I blame the perpetrator, I'm blaming me. So when I came home from my best friend's uncle's story, and I go home, Regina's mother is telling me it's not my fault. It takes me months to believe her. I'm sick to my stomach every time I wake up. I'm not telling my mother. I don't think I did eventually tell her about Uncle Charlie. I don't think I ever told her about Regina's uncle. And so when I come home from that, I just feel dirty. I feel bad about me. I'm scrubbing me with cleanser. I'm sick to my stomach. I'm pulling the blanket over my head. I'm trying to go back to sleep. I'm clinically depressed for 6 months. In the story Shattered, I'm clinically depressed for a good year or more. And it's not a matter of my brain chemistry was born wrong. It's a response to the trauma. And what allowed me in those cases, and I consider myself fortunate because they were each discrete one-time events. And so while there's this pattern of men being weird in that world that I'm growing up in, I'm not my brother Sean. I don't have one perpetrator who keeps having access to me. And so in each of those situations, Uncle Charlie, Shattered, my best friend's uncle, I get to go through 6 months or a year or whatever of mourning and grieving and facing it, and then it's not happening anymore. And somewhere along that period of months to a year, I get mad at him. And that's when I began to be a survivor. Because when it finally clicks to me in my grief, it's like, wait, I'm not dirty. He was dirty. He was thinking dirty. He was acting dirty. What I'm feeling is his dirt vibe put on me, but it's not my dirt vibe, it's his. And when I got pissed at the perpetrator, I was no longer mad at me. And so while there may be space for forgiveness, like I don't bother walking around hating any of those 3 individual males. But I also didn't work to prematurely forgive them. Like what they did is between them and their God, whatever that is or isn't. It's, I believe they had a moral responsibility to do differently. I'm in a spiritual community now where a lot of people talk about soul contracts before we come here.
Yeah.
And I personally don't believe that that Uncle Charlie and I made a soul contract on the other side, that he would perpetrate against me to teach me a lesson, and that he was doing me a favor, and that he's really a wonderful, highly evolved soul. I actually think he had a moral responsibility to not do that. And I worry that he did it for a lot of years to a lot of other people, because he did have, his wife had a sister with Down syndrome that was not verbal. And I never heard her talk in the times that I met her. And I believe he may have perpetrated, like retrospectively, the thought occurred to me even back then, like that he had her to perpetrate against for 30 years or so before she died. And or were there little girls in the neighborhood, like who I have the sense he may have had actually, large numbers of victims. And, because if you're still doing that at 83, like, like it's got to be a little bit of diminution of sex drive for an 83-year-old, even if you're male. And so it is that I believe he had a responsibility to make a different moral choice. And the fact that he didn't is not on me. And I do not expect on the other side to find out that he's highly evolved. But being mad at them is a necessary step toward transitioning into becoming a survivor, because as long as we're not mad at them, if we skip that step, if we don't at some point recognize that they're to blame and we're not, then we keep feeling bad about us. And so after you're mad at them, if you want to forgive them, fine. Just don't do it prematurely. So I think those two recognitions: one, I didn't do the thing. And two, this is happening to millions and millions of women and some millions of boys, mostly not adult men, unless you're perceived as gay or gender nonconforming. But definitely happening to prepubescent children of all genders, and seriously continuing to happen to women well into adulthood and even into old age. And that's a social problem. I do also mention in this book, in a section that starts on page 1 and called rape free versus rape free culture. There is in the history of societies that anthropologists and early explorers stumbled upon, and of course that we damaged when we colonized them. But there is a record of pre-modern societies in which there was no rape, and in which the gender roles were done differently, in which men didn't dominate women, women weren't taught to be submissive. Some of those cultures, both men and women were submissive, some both men and women were dominant, some women were dominant, men submissive, but there were rape-free cultures, which means it's not a biological imperative. And I argue that we are a thinking species, and therefore we can change this. If we change the gendered messages and the sexual messages that we're giving to children and to youth, but that means it's families, it's schools, it's media of all kinds, it's the porn industry. It's like a giant, huge social structure that teaches and perpetrates what's going on. But there have been cultures that were rape free, and we could ostensibly, arguably be one if we did that work. So.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sullivan, for enlightening us, and really educating us on things that, are often very hard to hear and very hard to believe. And as a survivor myself, and I'm sure with other survivors, it's important to, meet other people that, are championing for women, and who are taking a stand, so that we too can, feel included and take a stand alongside of you. So thank you.
I want to thank you for your work and for the work that all the women in the fight against sexual violence are doing. This work is so important. We all believe that we can make a difference, or we wouldn't
Yes.
We believe it can be different for our daughters and granddaughters, and even for us in the rest of our lives.
That is true.
So thank you so much for the work that you do as well.
Thank you. If you know of someone who is a survivor of sexual abuse, and which may lead also to domestic violence, or HIV, if you know of someone, or if you yourself are a survivor of sexual abuse, and you would like more information, please join me at www.healingwatersglobal.org. It is a safe, sacred space. It's a sisterhood of women where you will be believed, where you can trust, where you can share your story if you are ready to do so, where you can be encouraged and helped along your way to have those, to be helped along the way to empower yourself, to better yourself, and to become the person that you are meant to be. We are here. We are waiting for you. So please contact us and check us out. And stay tuned for our next She Reads podcast coming up in April. And there'll be more information about that coming soon. But thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.